Good afternoon.
Good
The
afternoon.
Lord reigns, and as the psalmist says, let the earth rejoice. And this is not your typical Friday table talk panel here. You'll notice that we've replaced Luke this week, and Kathy Mellum's here. Kathy's been serving uh, in the ministry here during this pandemic as our parish nurse. Maybe Kathy, just to start us off a little bit, how did you come into the parish nurse training? Just briefly, if you don't mind explaining to people, because you have a nursing background.
I do. I am a registered nurse, but when I came, I think partly when I came back from Africa, I was looking for a way to combine my faith and my nursing, and parish nursing was kind of a new idea that McMaster offered training, and so I did that training and didn't end up at a church anywhere, but fell into the dementia care. Um, However, now or in the last year, it's been a good thing to be able to apply my expertise um, to the pandemic situation and public health nursing and the parish nursing.
Yeah,
Put it together.
we've been grateful for that,
Very
and I'm sure that many of you who have had to register on Sunday, if you've had a question, we've directed you, if it's a health-related one, to Kathy. And so if you haven't met her, here she is. We wanted to take some time today to talk about vaccines. They're quite controversial, and there's a lot of difficulty in terms of understanding all of the various pieces about it. And so we thought we'll try and do this in two parts today. The first part is we want to talk about the vaccines that are available, and the second part that we'll talk about is just some of the ethical questions that surround those. So, Kathy, we know that the government has been rolling out all sorts of vaccine programs, securing vaccines. What are those vaccines, maybe first of all, that have been secured by our Canadian government that have been approved?
Right. So now at the moment there are 4 that have been approved. Um, Johnson and Johnson or Janssen, either name for that company, has one. Pfizer was the first one that we saw. Then Moderna, and also just recently approved was the AstraZeneca one. Pfizer and Moderna are both mRNA vaccines, and then the Janssen and AstraZeneca are viral vector. So they have a different mechanism to how they work.
Right. Kathy, it might be helpful if you help our listeners describe how they work, because that's been some topic of debate, right? And you just mentioned 2 broader platforms that are used, right?
So essentially, what any vaccine does is introduce into your body a foreign protein. In the case of viral disease, it'll be a piece of virus. In the case of a bacteria, it would be the bacteria. And that little piece of protein, and in the case of COVID, it's a piece of the outside shell of the protein, the spike. And you've seen the pictures of the virus with all the spikes out. So it's that little spike thing which is what allows it to attach to the cells in your body. So the little protein gets introduced into your body goes, wait a minute, this does not belong to us, don't like it, get rid of it, builds up an immune response, which would be antibodies. That's what makes you feel sick when you get a disease, is all that cell action going on to get rid of that foreign protein. So a vaccine gives you a small amount of a controlled amount of a particular part of the virus to allow your body to recognize it as foreign and build an immune response. In the case of the mRNA ones, they're sending the messenger RNA. So they're sending the message already as RNA. It gets incorporated into your cell. Your body reads it. You use mRNA all the time in your body to make new blood cells, to make new skin cells. We're doing that all the time. Your body produces the messenger, like a recipe, tells your cell, make some of this. So the messenger goes, but the body sees this doesn't belong, And so instead of making more of that thing, it makes the antibodies, and the protein appears in your system. So the messenger RNA goes into the cell makes the spike protein, the immune response occurs. In the case of the viral vector, what those vaccines are using is a little bit of protein, again, attached to a different virus. Often they use the same kind of cold virus, but it's been rendered ineffective. But it still takes that foreign protein into your cell, and then there's another step. So the virus goes into your cell, and then the cell makes the messenger RNA, makes the protein, spits it out. The body says, wait a minute, this doesn't belong here, mounts the immune response. And as with all messenger RNA that your body uses all the time, including the messenger RNA in the vaccine, after it's done its recipe job and sent the message, it gets used up, or not used up, destroyed. It's not viable. It doesn't continue in your system in the same way that you don't have a lot of other messenger RNA hanging about your body from other things that your body's done with it.
That's helpful because a number of these vaccines, they're highly effective. So often they're looking for 60% plus effectiveness. We're talking for 3 of the 4, they're in the 94, 95% range from preventing serious illness and death. So that's a very good thing. But this has also raised all sorts of questions for Christians especially. I thought it'd be helpful for us to chat with you as well about some of those concerns. I think the first is in terms of the speed of development. Some people have they've wondered about how quickly these vaccines have been developed. Many vaccines have taken a dozen plus, 15 plus years to develop. And here we're developing vaccines for a novel coronavirus in about a year. So what would you say to folks, just if they had concerns about the speed of development and the testing process that's being done?
So the mRNA, this is the first time it's been used as a vaccine. It's not new technology, it's not new science. That actually has been around for probably 20 years, a little bit more. They've been working on it for other kinds of treatments, not just vaccines. And it's gone quickly, partly because all that research is ramped up, and then I think because everybody wants it. Everybody's government is willing to pay for it and put money up for it. So there's been a lot of funding up front, ready money for vaccine development, whereas typically if a company like Pfizer or anybody wanted to make a new vaccine for something, they would start out with some funding, allocate some money, do it, maybe test it a little bit, wait, have a break, more money. And so this way, this time there's been lots of interest, as we know, and lots of money available, real high demand. So the supply, the motivation to do it has just made it go that much more quickly. It's not untested. I actually looked to see, in the case of each virus, tens of thousands of people have been tested prior to being available on the market. AstraZeneca was the lowest at 11,000, and the Janssen one was 44. The other two were 30 and 43. So it's not like they didn't test it on a lot of people either, which I think has been another concern, that it's come so quickly. How do we know that it's okay? But they have tested it on, like I said, tens of thousands of people.
So my understanding as well with the testing process and regulatory approval is that often each step would be submitted one piece at a time, and then approval would be given before they would move to the next step.
Right.
But it seems that this has been different this time. Am I correct in understanding that?
Yeah, because of that incentive to do something as quickly as possible, then they've had it. They've condensed the timeline and not had to take so long to wait for the next approval to come.
Okay. I know there's also been the questions then around stem cells. And so this is probably the largest issue. So many people will have heard in the news, or they'll hear from pro-life websites questions about were these or were these vaccines developed using stem cells from an aborted fetus? So people will hear about, I think it's HEK 293 or PERC 6. I don't remember.
C6,
I don't remember exact details, but I've done a fair bit of reading, and I know that this is an area of controversy. So what would just maybe help us to understand, Kathy, the I won't put you on the spot in terms of the ethics of these things, but the origin of these stem cell lines and how we can understand how they've been used in the process.
Right. So I think pretty universally, all vaccines that are for viruses use stem cells as the growth medium for the virus that they need in order to prepare the protein to put into the vaccine. And in each case, there's, I believe, and I'm not 100%, I don't remember from what I read, there's at least 2, but I think there might be 3 lines of stem cells that are, they're not from a new abortion, they're from, one was from 1985, and I think the other one is 1970 something, 77 maybe. So the stem cells can continue to live. They keep them in laboratory conditions as a growing medium. So it's there. It isn't necessary to get more stem cells from more abortions. It's from an older historical abortion, and everybody seems to be using the same stem cell line because they can replicate those without easily and without a lot of difficulty, and it provides a really good medium for growing virus.
So I think there is just confusion because in part it seems to me that the term abortion has been used in a fairly generic way. It could, am I correct in understanding it could refer to a pregnancy that was not viable or a deliberately aborted pregnancy? Is that correct?
Yeah. So the stem cells are what they're sort of the precursor in the unborn baby. We all started with stem cells, and then the stem cells, as they multiply, become more specific in their job. So you started with a whole bunch of stem cells, and some of them turned into your nervous systems, your neurons, your nerve cells. Others turned into your skin cells, your heart cells, all that sort of thing. So stem cells are the beginning, and they don't have any particular purpose until they've replicated so many times and start to specialize in their job within the body. So it would be early in the fetus that the stem cells would be present for that. And because they don't have a purpose, then it allows scientists to use them for the virus to grow.
Now, before we came on, you and I were just chatting briefly about many Catholics in terms of, like, we often find that Catholics are very helpful in terms of their development of a pro-life ethic is quite clear. I don't know how familiar are you? Where would Catholics be in our country with regards to their understanding of the developments of these vaccines?
Well, I think there would be some concern about the stem cell. I think some of what I read was was that the need for the vaccine maybe outweighed the concern about the stem cells. The fact that I think that it's not recent abortions or requiring more abortions that
Right.
I think has been helpful to think through the implications of using stem cells.
So Gary, we're going to take a little bit of extra time here today, just because this becomes a complicated piece for us as Christians. And so, Gary, what kind of thoughts would you be encouraging a Christian who's maybe they've never been thinking about the ethics of vaccines before? Maybe some people have. There are those who are definitely concerned about how vaccines are used, but suddenly this is on our radar. People are thinking, they're talking. There's a whole lot of information. Where would we start helping a Christian to think about this particular issue regarding the ethics of these vaccines?
I guess I think one important thing to take off the table, just to be absolutely clear, and I think you've attempted to do this, Kathy, but in no way is this promoting an abortion industry. The fact that we are developing vaccines is not promoting. No one has either a financial interest to gain from promoting abortions so that they can somehow monetize that by selling off to the pharma industry. So that we can take off the table.
Perhaps too, just to add that there are no stem cells in the vaccine.
Right.
It's only they're only used to grow the virus in order to make the vaccine. So they're not in the vaccine that people are being given.
Either development or testing.
Or testing.
Yeah. And then, Andrew, you raised this as well, and I would encourage people to do research on their own as well, and just don't rely on us only. The Gospel Coalition has put out a number of articles that have tried to attack this issue from different viewpoints, and like Joe Carter is one that's written extensively on this, an American pastor and theologian. So I would say as well, Andrew, you touched on some of the questions that we have. It's not clear sometimes where these stem cells are from, whether it was a spontaneous abortion, that is to say, something that happened naturally, or whether it was something that was procured to terminate a pregnancy. And we don't know that answer. Some of these, one of the lines, I believe, Kathy, is even from the 60s, a Dutch line, I believe. So there isn't great clarity, unfortunately. There's probably a little bit more I could say, but have you got anything, any way you want to weigh on this? I wasn't necessarily anticipating us talking a whole lot about the ethics thing. I think it's important.
Well, and I think it's helpful for Christians as well to maybe think about how something could have been done in the past that we find morally either objectionable or questionable, but the ongoing results are, we don't want to destroy that. So I think of World War II, specifically in the Asia portion, in the battle with Japan, and we could talk about how peace was secured by the use of the nuclear bomb, and that while there was hundreds of thousands of lives that were wrongfully killed, civilians died. We don't want to go back and erase the history of the peace that was secured and say that this peace that we now have is not valid. The way that it was secured certainly is something that we never want to have happen again. But regardless, we don't erase what has been done so as to undo the past. Now Christians are going to then, Gary, they're going to struggle as to being pro-vaccine or anti-vax, and certainly that's going to raise issues. Even what are we going to do here on a Sunday, for example? Are we going to have a pro-vaccine service and an anti-vax service? And so COVID, if anything, has brought out a real judginess in our culture.
Right.
You're standing less than 6 feet apart. My goodness, people look at you. How are we going to work through this as a church?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one I think we took some great care last summer when we went through Romans. I think we had 4 sermons on Romans in particular, Romans 13 and Romans 14. 13 comes into play. Well, let me back up one step. The rule of submission to government, for instance, right? You can have two, I don't want to call them extremes, two realities. Sometimes there's the need out of Acts 5:29 to say we obey God rather than man. But then at the same time, Paul preaches very clearly in Romans 13 that we are to submit to government authority. All authority is ordained by God. And to actually resist the governing authority or civic authority is to actually directly disobey God. So obviously then there's these two endpoints and then a spectrum in between that requires, I think, a lot of discernment and conscience. And so when Paul moves through 13 and into Romans 14, that's where he talks about Christian conscience and that brother to brother, we're not to bind another person's conscience. We're only supposed to drill into our own and do what we feel called to do, or what we feel to obey, whether it's certain holidays or not, or what foods we eat. Those are a matter for our own conscience to decide, and that's the obligation of the believer. One, to be convicted and act according to your convictions, but then likewise not to bind. And Andrew, I think in terms of decisions of conscience, I think too of a verse. So Paul, when he's instructing Timothy on his pastoring, in his second letter, or what we know is the second letter, chapter 2:24, I think it is, and he gives kind of 3 qualifications. One, the servant of the Lord is to be an apt teacher, and that we expect, right? But 2 other things are really helpful for us in these times, and the one is that he's not to be quarrelsome. And then secondly, he's to patiently endure evil. So even evil he is to patiently endure. And so if we are called as the Lord's servants to patiently endure evil, how much more should we patiently endure a brother who has a different conviction than us? All right, so I think that's really important to keep in mind. And then on the practical side, how are we to not be quarrelsome? That's sort of the demand or the standard. I think in terms of practically walking that out, I think it calls for us to really have a deeply rooted humility, because it's out of humility, out of regard, out of preference for our brother, that then we won't be quarrelsome. You know, you're going to tend to be quarrelsome if you think you're the smartest guy in the block, and when you walk into the room, your opinions are the only ones that should be heard. Now, I don't think anyone would say that overtly, but really check your heart. And so if you are quick to quarrel, if you're quick to judge, then I'd ask you to really have the Lord search your heart. And is there any humility to be found there?
So you brought up Romans 14, which is a helpful passage, because some Christians are going to feel or think that it's very clear that the stem cell line issue is an immediate disqualifying factor, and it's a pretty black and white issue for them. Others are going to say there's uncertainty, there's a lack of clarity in terms of the origins of that stem cell line, or that the development of the stem cell line is so far removed that I do not have a conscience issue bothering me in taking the vaccine. And that's where I think this does become a Romans 14 issue, is that we're going to have people who are going to feel that this is a very black and white issue. There are other people who are going to be very clearly in the camp of this is a matter of conscience, and we're going to have to bear with one another in love and remember that our consciences. So as Gary used that phrase, binding the conscience, our consciences, we can only do what we are convinced of by faith, and whatever is not done of faith in faith is sin. And that's Paul's argument in Romans 14. So So then what we want to do is we want to have good, adequate knowledge. We want to go to professionals and not just merely to the latest website that's got the latest piece that's up. Kathy's a great resource. Mark has been a fantastic resource as well, Kathy's husband. And I encourage you, if you do have questions, you can talk with them.
Absolutely.
And beyond that, I would say, as a church, we will aim to love one another and respect one another in our disagreements on these issues. This is not unlike for the Jews and the Greeks or the Gentiles in Romans, the meat offered to idols and meat that's not the ethics of eating meat offered to idols. And for a Gentile, it would have been no issue, no concern. For a Jew, it would have bothered their conscience deeply. And so we're not going to say, this is what you have to do. We are going to say, you need to know your own conscience. I would say one last thing about your conscience too. Some people's consciences are very tender. And because they're very tender, when we have a tender conscience person, we need to be mindful that our forcefulness about either being pro or anti-vaccine could actually do a brother or sister's conscience damage. And so out of love, Gary, that verse from 2 Timothy 2:24 to 26 is excellent. We want to be gentle, not quarrelsome. And I think as we listen and talk to one another, we will be able to serve one another in love. Maybe, Kathy, one last question. I didn't put this on the sheet and email this to you, but there is concern about, well, what happens if I have to get a vaccine passport? And maybe I won't be able to travel if I... Is that a real possibility? And what kind of thoughts should people have from a medical perspective on that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a possibility that policy might come into place where a country that you would like to go to would say you may not come unless we can be sure that you're not bringing COVID with you. So if you've been vaccinated, then we know that you're safe. It's okay for you to travel. So it may be that will be, I think there are places already where that's true. So it could be that having a vaccine, you may need to be demonstrating that you do have a vaccine in order to go to certain places or do certain things or participate in an event perhaps, or it's hard to say at this point how that'll work out.
Yeah.
So now the pastor in me wants to address that, say, from an ethical point of view. So here's what I would encourage you to do. So I think, and I think you'll agree with this, that we have to be careful not to have pragmatism drive out our ethics. And I know that's not the purpose of your question. It's just a natural question. But just as a pastor, I would advise you try to cross that bridge before you address the practical concerns that you may have, whether that's because of your work environment or travel plans that you have. Settle this question ethically in your own heart. And we encourage you, like we said, I don't know if there are other resources you can point them to, Andrew, but I mentioned the Gospel Coalition. You can search their website. There's lots there. 9 Marks has done articles as well. I don't think, like for me, obviously, I want to travel, for instance, to see a grandchild, but I'm not going to get the vaccine or not get the vaccine based on my travel plans. That'll just be a consequence that comes out of an ethical decision that I make as a person.
And that's a good qualification, because I don't want people to end up in the position where they're surprised, where all of a sudden we've got to be vaccinated if we're traveling. And so to your point, Gary, that's exactly right, that the pressures will be real, and we have to be a people who are convictional, not merely just pragmatic. As always, there's tons more questions. Maybe you've got some, you can leave them in the comments on Facebook here. You can always email Gary, myself. Kathy, you can email her at parishnurse@cbcelderton.ca, and she'll be glad to point you in the right direction there as well. Pastorally, Gary and I will answer those questions that are related to ethics. Kathy and Mark, they'll answer the questions related to the medical components. And as always, the greater aim is that by faith we would honor Jesus Christ, we would love one another, love our neighbor, and that in so doing, that Christ would be honored and glorified. Church, this is an hour for us to pull together in love and not to pull apart. So that's a full table talk today. We've taken a little extra time, but again, we're always grateful to worship with you on Sunday. If you didn't register and you're watching before Sunday, you can always give Amy an email, and you can find her email on the website. Again, cbcelderton.ca, on the staff page. You'll find her a link to her email address there. So that's all for today, Kathy. Thank you for coming in and sharing
thank you
with
very
us.
much, Kathy.
Yeah, and
thank you for joining us.
Yeah, until next time, I'll be off next week, but we'll see you again on Table Talk. God bless. Bye for now.
Bye.